Hello and welcome to the Splendor of Truth. I am the author Januarius Asongu, and today we are going to begin part 3 of the book. Today, we continue our journey through the book by entering what we describe as agency, building the rational society and the good life. But before we begin with chapter 8 itself, let me briefly recap where we are coming from. A recap of part 2, which was called the refutation. In those chapters, I confronted some of the major forms of irrationality that continue to imprison human societies: witchcraft causality, fatalism, destiny thinking, generational curses, and the misuse of prayer as a substitute for agency. The goal of part 2 was not to attack culture or even religious faith. The goal was liberation, because a society trapped in epistemic distortion cannot flourish. A people who attribute every failure to mystical forces often lose the capacity for critical reflection, institutional accountability, and rational action. So in part two, if part two was fundamentally about clearing the ground, removing illusion, exposing unwarranted claims, restoring the integrity of reason. But philosophy cannot stop with criticism. After deconstruction must come reconstruction. After refutation must come agency. And that brings us to part 3, introducing uh, agency. Part 3 asks one of the most important questions in the entire book. Once humanity learns to think critically, rather, what kind of society should we build? This section moves from epistemology to civilization, from knowledge to ethics, from truth to political order, from rational enquiry to human flourishing. Truth is not an end in itself. Truth exists so that human beings may live more freely, more justly, and more wisely. And that is why part 3 focuses on democracy, ethics, fairness, happiness, sustainability, love, and the architecture of the good society. The first chapter in this section is chapter 8, and chapter 8 is entitled Political Philosophy: The Defense of Democracy. Now, let me say something important from the beginning. This chapter is not a partisan political argument. It is not a defense of one party, one country, or one ideology. It is a philosophical defense of democracy itself. And my argument is very simple. Democracy is humanity's best system because it institutionalizes self-correction. That is the key idea. Democracy matters not because democratic societies are perfect. They are not. Democracies can be corrupt, citizens can be manipulated, media systems can become distorted, and governments can fail. But democracy possesses something extraordinarily important: the ability to recognize and correct error. And that makes democracy epistemically superior to authoritarian systems. Democracy as institutionalized self-correction. One of the central ideas in this chapter comes from the philosopher Karl Popper, whose work deeply influenced my own philosophical framework of critical synthetic realism, CSR. Popper argued that science advances because theories remain open to falsification. Scientists proposed ideas. Those ideas are tested, errors are exposed, knowledge improves. I argue in chapter 8 that democracy works similarly. Healthy democracies create mechanisms for criticism and correction. These are like free speech, opposition parties, investigative journalism, academic freedom, judicial review, elections, and peaceful transfer of power, just to name a few. These are not weaknesses, they are civilization's immune system. They allow societies to learn from their mistakes because those mistakes become catastrophic. Authoritarian systems often suppress criticism in the name of unity or strength. But once criticism disappears, correction also disappears. And when correction disappears, decline becomes inevitable. Democracy and human fallibility. Critical synthetic realism begins with the simple principle. You've heard me say it in the previous chapters. Truth exists objectively, but human beings are fallible. No individual possesses total understanding. No ideology is infallible. No government is omniscient. That means societies must create structures capable of correcting human error. Democracies does precisely that. That is why I describe democracy in this chapter as institutionalized falsifiability. A dictatorship assumes certainty. A democracy assumes corrigibility. And in a world of imperfect human beings, corrigibility is essential for survival. Let's look at the literature behind this chapter. Uh, Now, let me briefly discuss some of the intellectual traditions that have influenced my thought. This work stands within a long conversation of political philosophy. From Plato, we inherit the concern that societies can descend into manipulation and irrationality. From Aristotle, we inherit the idea that politics exists for human flourishing, what he calls eudaimonia. From Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, we inherit social contract theory and the modern understanding of political legitimacy. From John Stuart Mill, we inherit the defense of liberty and free inquiry. From Karl Popper, we inherit the principle that open societies survive because they allow criticism. From Jürgen Habermas, we inherit the importance of communicative rationality and public discourse. And from contemporary democratic theories, feminist thinkers, liberation theologians, and communication traditions, we inherit important critiques of inequality, exclusion, and structural injustice. Chapter 8 attempts to synthesize these traditions within the framework of critical synthetic realism. It defends democracy while also insisting that democracy must remain morally serious, intellectually responsible, and permanently self critical. The crisis of democracy today. Now, let me speak directly about our present moment. One reason I wrote this chapter is because I believe democracy is entering one of the most dangerous periods in human history. Not necessarily because democracy is being defeated militarily, but because it is being destabilized epistemically. We now live in a world where algorithms shape perception, outrage spreads faster than reflection, artificial intelligence can fabricate reality, and tribal loyalty often matters more than evidence. People increasingly inhabit separate informational universes. And once citizens lose a shared understanding of reality, democratic dialogue becomes nearly impossible. Democracy depends upon truth, not perfect truth, not total certainty, but enough shared reality for rational disagreement to remain possible. And that shared reality is weakening globally. Education and the survival of freedom. This is why education becomes absolutely central. A democracy cannot survive merely by holding elections. It requires citizens capable of critical thinking, of intellectual humility, of rational evaluation, and moral courage. Without those capabilities, freedom becomes vulnerable to manipulation. A population trained only to consume information rather than evaluate it critically becomes easy to deceive. And once deception becomes normalized, democratic institutions weaken from within. This is why I repeatedly argue throughout the book that the defense of truth is inseparable from the defense of freedom towards the epistemic republic. Towards the end of chapter 8, I introduce the idea of what I call the epistemic republic. This is a vision of democracy grounded not merely in elections, but in truth seeking, in evidence based reasoning, in institutional accountability, transparency, and ethical responsibility. In the epistemic republic, education matters, inquiry matters, criticism matters, and no person or institution stands above truth. Because truth must always remain greater than power. Introducing the next chapters. Now, as chapter 8 concludes, the book begins moving from politics into ethics and human flourishing itself. In the next chapter, chapter 9, is entitled The Architecture of Flourishing. If chapter 8 asks, what political system best supports rational civilization, then chapter 9 asks, what does it actually mean for human beings to flourish? There we move beyond democracy itself into deeper questions about happiness, about fairness, about compassion, about sustainability, about love, and about the moral foundations of civilization. Because ultimately, politics is not an end in itself. The purpose of political order is human flourishing. And that is where the journey continues next. Thank you so much for joining me. Again, I am Januarius Asongu, the author of The Splendor of Truth.